You know it's coming, right? Aloha! All right, let's get it started. Good morning, as Sharon said. I'm Richard Taylor. I've had the honor of being the president and chairman of the board of PTC for 2013, and on behalf of the board, and as Sharon said, on behalf of the Secretariat, we welcome you to PTC'14, New World, New Strategies. To make a great program come together takes a lot of people, and I just want to take a moment to do my thank yous, and on behalf of the board, to all our sponsors who make it possible to put on such a terrific set of activities for you. I want to thank the conference co-chairs, as Sharon mentioned, Joe Weinman, Masaaki Sakamaki, and Dr. Francis Pereira. I would just sort of observe that they represent, respectively, these sort of business, regulatory, and academic constituencies of PTC, all working together to put together a great program. So that's really one of the things that makes PTC so great, is we have that diversity that adds value for everybody. I want to thank the board's program committee who assisted them, and I particularly want to thank Sharon Nakama and her staff. She is shy, but she and her staff do an enormous amount of work to make this possible, to put all this together. So I want to thank her and the staff for that. I'd like to thank all of the members. It's a membership organization, so where would we be without you? And also welcome all of those of you who may not be members, and urge you to become members, because we need your support, and we think we can add value to you and to your businesses or to the work that you do. With that, and a great appreciation to everyone who has made this possible, you will note that in the program I am designated as the convener. This is my ceremonial role as president, so I can get to say that the PTC'14 is now officially open, and so we're off and running. The curtain, it's time for the curtain to go up, and the first event that we have, and we're very fortunate to have, very happy to have, is our opening keynote speaker, Bill Barney. I would call him William, but you probably wouldn't know who I was talking about. I don't think there's anyone who doesn't know him as Bill. He's recently been appointed CEO of Reliance, Globalcom's offshore businesses. So he's got a lot on his hands to get started. He's an industry veteran with many years, 15 years at least, in working in the Asia-Pacific region. Prior to the current position, he was for 10 years CEO of PacNet. Many of you know him. Before that, he was Pacific President and CEO for MCI WorldCom. I'm happy to say Bill is hardly a stranger to PTC. In fact, he's been very active in our leadership. He spent 6 years himself on the Board of Governors. And so he is going to be talking us today about power, lasers, and spectrum will be the cornerstones of new strategies in the Asia-Pacific region. And so with that, I say, please join me in welcoming Bill back to PTC.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. It does look like it's good to be back here. Nothing like having your first day presenting to a bunch of guys in Hawaiian shirts. So it's a pretty exciting day back in my first day in the telecom industry, which it is actually officially today. I joined Reliance Globalcom as their CEO on Friday night, and Sharon offered me the opportunity to speak here Monday morning. So bear with me as we go through this, and it should be a fun experience. What I'd like to do today is really just talk about what's the themes of the conference, but also what do we think are the ways you can play these types of trends as operators. So I'm really going to look at it and say, okay, what do we do as operators? How do we do it? How do we operate as companies in this new environment? We're going to focus on a couple things. First, who are the new customers? Who are we all playing to these days? How do we participate in these trends? Let's also talk about whether it's all up from here. Everyone talks about cloud computing, the opportunity. I'll tell you there are some challenges as well, and I think we need to all think through those, and then give you some final thoughts on how we actually can approach this strategically as an industry and as companies going forward. This is a Mary Meeker slide. It's actually very interesting. It talks about who are the users today, and what about our generation? The people in this room, how are we different from customers from 20 years ago? When we started doing telecommunications in the 80s and 90s, who are our customers? The customers today are very, very different. They've had to live through September 11th. You've had to live through a changing in terms of the world. Asia's become the center, or not the center of the universe, but the center of growth for the future. China has become a power for us globally. And we've also seen things like the financial crisis, which has totally changed the way we look at banks and financial institutions. So we've had a very, very different view, and these customers look at things in a very, very different way. We've also seen a changing of the guard on the technology side. We saw the rise of Steve Jobs. We saw the rise of Google. We saw a rise of many new tech companies. If you think about it, the 70s and 80s were dominated largely by computer companies. If you look at the last 10 years, it's really been driven by companies off of the internet. And that's really changed also the way we think about companies and how these customers operate and look at things. And what I tell you is these customers, if you look around this room, I'm looking around 5 years ago, there would have been 15 to 20 laptops in here. Virtually everybody in this room now is using some form of tablet device. So we've actually changed, even in this room, to what we call an asset-light group of people. So we essentially today don't actually use computers ourselves. We've actually moved our compute power to somewhere else, and we operate today in what we call the asset-light generation. And if you look at, just on this slide, on the right side, those are the operating systems of the asset-light compute. So essentially you've got your Androids and you've got your Apple. And if you look at it today, almost 55% of all operating systems are actually for tablets or for wireless devices. And if you look at it 5 years ago, it was largely dominated by PC. It was Windows. And if you look at Windows, actually was the guys that generated, they were the main players for the last 25 years. One of the other things that's changed, we've changed our system in terms of how we operate. We've actually gone from what I call their web to our web to my personal web. If you look at it, social network has driven networks to a point where we actually today, as consumers, really look at how we actually can get content that we need specifically for us. And this actually changes completely how we look at networks, because this creates an environment where every single individual actually has to have a network, they have to have storage, and they have to have compute. And this really changes how we build networks, because in the past, the computes were actually with these people. We were actually just building transport networks. Now we actually have to build transport networks by individual. And this really changes how actually as an operator we have to look at building our business. The other thing that's changed is the velocity of change in terms of how do companies come to market. And if you look, and I'll talk at the end about some of these new companies, but if you looked at in the past, the companies actually getting to 100,000 users or 1 million users used to take between 3 to 5 to 7 years, okay? I'm going to show you 20 companies at the end that have actually gotten to 1 million users in 3 months, okay? And that just starts to give you the velocity of change and the speed in this new environment that people actually can grow and build businesses and build commerce. How do we play this? So it's very challenging. I think and I don't think people have really realized the impact of what the cloud is doing and how fast companies actually are moving in this space, and actually how fast this industry is actually going. Key thing for us is how do we play this? How do we play it in the emerging markets in particular, which is Asia Pacific? There's going to be a myriad of speakers that are going to come after me. There'll be 6, 7 guys. They're going to talk about 3 things, okay? They're going to talk about data centers. They're going to talk about fiber networks, and finally they're going to talk about what I call cloud orchestration, which is how do you actually play in the cloud, how do you actually play in this new world? And they'll largely talk about these 3 topics because as operators, this is how you actually play in the space. And be it NTT, AT&T, BT, you're actually all coming to the same conclusions that you've got to be in these 3 areas to actually participate going forward. Key things, think about. 1, data centers, okay? We've all been talking about this the last 5 years. The PTC, almost nobody talked about data centers until 5 years ago. Now, when I look at the list of sponsors, you have guys like CoreSite, Equinix, all playing here at the PTC. It's not coming here because they love us. It's because they realize that this is where there's business to be generated. Fiber networks. I'll tell you that this is actually the revival of the fiber networks. And I think one of the things that's important as you start to look at cloud, the density of networks that are required to deliver cloud services are going to make fiber back in vogue again. And I would tell you, most of you that have been in the fiber businesses, it's been a long 10, 11 years, but I think you will see that there's a huge opportunity to play in that space. And then finally, this area which I call cloud orchestration. And this is really where businesses play in the layer 4, layer 5, and layer 6. So how do you actually play in that space or the new switching technologies going forward? And that's really going to be, I believe, where a lot of the innovation is going to happen, but also a lot of the growth. And I'll talk about all three of these in terms of how you can play. First, data centers. Great business, challenging business going forward. There's going to be two types of data centers, I believe, in the world. There's going to be what I call FOX and stocks. FOX are data centers that are in the city centers. These are centers that actually will be delivering content. This will be where Google will sit. This will be where Amazon will sit. This will be all the major key technology companies that need to get to the consumer will sit. There's also going to need to be storage, and we call them storage centers. And these are the big centers. They're going to be off near dams and power generation locations, and they'll be massive. And the reason is all of us have a way of putting and storing information. Humans are pack mules. We're pack mules with everything we own, from old shirts to old furniture, and we're going to be that way with old movies and actually everything on the web. And we're going to have to park it somewhere. And so I think what you're going to see is over the next couple of years, there's going to be a real change in data centers. There's going to be what I call the forward operating centers, which are going to be the ones that are dynamic, moving very, very quickly, high-powered, really have a nice techie feel, and then you're going to see these large warehouses out in the countryside that are actually storing all of our personal information. One of the other things you're going to see as a network operator that scares me and scares everyone that's in this is that the internet transit business, okay, most of it will actually happen in these forward operating centers. We actually won't sell internet transit necessarily going point to point anymore. Most of it will actually stay in the data centers. And this is actually what's happening today. If you look at it today, almost 40% of all internet traffic just stays inside data centers. This will be 70 to 80% over the next couple of years. Good thing about fiber, and if you look at, I used to do a lot of these talks here at PTC, 90 to 2002. If you look at that little fiber segment, the little international bit was always the place where there wasn't a lot of fiber. Well, thanks a lot to a lot of the technology providers over the last 5 years, we've gone from 10G to 40G to 100G, and we actually have a view to 1000G. So if you look at pretty much 2011 forward, we now actually have networks that are connected across the planet that are actually large enough where the submarine cable side can actually interconnect with the local access network, and you actually have the speeds to actually do that. One of the key other things is you've seen mobile and wireless has actually led to a point where you can accelerate big data. One of the interesting stats, today in India, there are actually more wireless data users than there are fixed line users. And this is in every single location around the world. And this is really just a change in terms of what's happening in terms of access, and this in terms of building the pipe to go from point A to point B. It's happening, and it's happening for big data, and it's largely driven by LTE and 3G. This slide right here talks about, this is going to be a network map, what we're going to look at in 5 years, which is sort of what I call an orchestration map. Okay, so how do we actually look at the cloud, and how do we actually build networks in the cloud? And it's going to be very different. It's going to be the data center will be sitting at the center, and the networks will be at the edge. Similar to how Steve Jobs talked about the fact that we were going to actually move all of our compute out into the cloud, we're actually going to move our networks outside of the data center. The data center is actually going to become the center from which we actually operate. And this will generate companies like this. These are companies, if you look at Bleacher Report, 53, you go down through the list, these are all some of the highest growing companies. All of them on the internet, all of them in the last 24 months have actually grown at lightning speed. Is it all up from here? A lot of people would say so. You're going to hear a lot of lectures today that cloud is here. It's a change of the paradigm. I tell you, it is and it isn't. If you look at this chart, this just actually shows where companies are in terms of free cash flow and EBITDA. And a lot of the darlings, okay, for example, mobile, wireless companies, you got data center companies up there. You actually have telecom companies, you have telecom equipment companies. All of us have sort of risen up to 10, 12, 14 times EBITDA, which generally in our industry is a pretty good multiple, and then sort of over time dropped to about 5 to 6 times EBITDA. And what's happened is there's actually an efficiency or a commoditization that happens in the industry. That too will happen in cloud, okay? So what you're going to see is we will gravitate back towards those types of things. It doesn't mean that we're not a great industry, but it means that euphoria will last for a period of time, and then we'll actually have rationalization. And we're actually now starting to see it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the data center industry because we are seeing it in an industry that was for the last 5 years, probably one of the hottest industries on the planet. And I can show you how we've actually changed there. And so the reason I'm telling you this is we'll sit here today for the next 3 hours and talk about the opportunities, and there are huge ones, but there are also pitfalls. And if you look at telecom companies, you look at equipment companies, there are challenges that we're going to all have to face. One of the interesting things, here's data centers. Most exciting thing about data center business plans, price per rack actually goes up, okay? So power goes up, price per rack. It's the only thing in our industry that anyone could sell because it was actually having prices that were appreciating, not depreciating. Well, that was a great thing. The challenge was, if you look at the slide on the right, to actually, as you're starting to go up that power curve, at the same time, you're essentially taking out cash in terms of capital. So what happened was most of the data center companies, I wouldn't say all of them, but about 40% of them got to a point where they're no longer generating cash. So they had negative cash flow, okay? And so while everyone was excited and we were all pumping money in the equity markets, at the same time you saw this shift where we started to lose cash. Now the good ones actually were able to attack. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because I think as we start thinking about cloud, the next generation of models, we got to be tacking now and thinking about what to do next. If you look at additional cash flow, the great data center companies, the ones that are still doing well and still are the darlings, are the ones that said, okay, I'm going to go into services. I'm going to go into actually new types of cloud computing type services. I'm going to do into managed hosting. I'm going to move away from just being a sheer colo operator. And it totally changed the model for some of them. And I think if there's a lesson to be learned, and as telcos and as operators in the space, cloud is going to accelerate at a very, very fast pace. But the challenge is actually how to do it smartly and make sure that you actually are one of the winners at the end. And it means doing things like with the data center that smart data center guys did, which is tack when they had to. This just shows you 2010. You look at, and the key thing to look at here is look at the yellow and the red boxes. Those are the guys that weren't doing well, okay? Now if you look at 2014, these are the guys, they're almost half. So essentially you had an industry that went from almost nobody in the business could make a mistake to almost half the industry. And if you apply this to the telecom companies from 2001 to 2004, you'd have a similar set of charts. And all I'd say is as you start looking forward into the cloud, make sure that you've actually thought all these things through. Final thoughts. The future is really going to be about asset-light users. So people that actually use tablets, small compute, how do you actually deliver services to those new sets of users? If you think about it, what's going to happen is we as fiber operators, as data center operators, have the opportunity right now. This is a huge opportunity for us. We have the opportunity to play in a space where today computer industry has actually played. We have a chance to actually go out and use our fiber and use our data center assets to participate in new markets. Personal content will actually drive huge uses of the internet. This is going to be a fantastic opportunity for us. We will actually be able to see growth. If you look at internet trends, and if you'll hear telegeography later in this conference talk about it, internet growth is continuing to grow at 40 to 50% a year, pretty much market by market. So huge growth coming from this. You're also going to see, like the fixed line boom, essentially the internet boom, the mobile revolution, and now the cloud. There will be models that work and those that won't work. I showed you those 10 companies. Those guys are all billionaires, okay? So there's going to be a lot of billionaires generated over the next 5 years, okay? In the next 10 years, there'll be a lot of guys that will struggle. And the reason for that is we all tend to jump towards the euphoria, and what we need to be doing is really looking at how do we actually participate in this market in a smart way, but actually monetize it and think about it. Survivors of the next 10 years, obviously, are the ones that have infrastructure. I believe, and the reason why I'm standing here today, I made the decision I made last Friday, was to actually be in a business that's an infrastructure-related company, because I believe in this next generation, the key is actually going to be in the emerging markets of the world, to actually be able to deliver services and actually own the cables, the data centers, and have the orchestration capability in those markets. Massive growth and wealth creation will happen. I'll tell you that if companies continue to focus on positioning themselves in the right segment, and it doesn't mean that you have to be a data center company or a submarine cable company or a software company. The key thing is to know where you play in the paradigm and to join it and to play it smartly. I'll leave you with one last thought. Probably his greatest prophecy. Steve Jobs said he was going to everyone would move everything into the cloud. The reality is, it has become reality. I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much. Questions? Is anyone awake? Sure. we get a microphone out here?
Hi there, Bill. Thank you very much for your compelling presentation. Is the industry just too dynamic to strategize for, to predict? And secondly, are we really just talking about contending with a permanent deflationary tsunami within the industry and trying to find ways to accommodate sort of gigantic deflationary pressures?
I think yes, that's a very good characterization. I think there is going to be deflation, but there's also growth. If you look at the industry as a whole, prices are coming down. But I would tell you, and the challenge I would say, if you looked at, just take fiber for example, okay, you really were seeing fiber prices dropping 20–25% a year for the last 10 years, okay? But technology-wise, you weren't actually moving up the curve that fast. That's changed the last 3 years. So essentially, operators now are seeing a huge cash flow opportunity. If you're in the submarine cable space, you can run 40G, 100G. You've essentially lowered your capital expenditure. So you've actually had, the opportunity to actually expand. I would tell you though that this industry has been plagued with deflationary challenges its entire time, and it will continue to do so. And that's really just because there's efficiency coming into the markets, right? So essentially, the technology, like computing, actually becomes efficient over time. And so we will always contend with that. Prices will always come down. There'll be very few products that will be able to go to market and say, yes, we're going to raise the price. In fact, I'm looking for the one where we're actually truly raising the price. Other questions? Sure.
It's obviously subject to a lot of deflationary pressure. IRU, you get your money up front. Which model does Reliance prefer, and what will you be doing going forward?
Easy answer, both. You got to play in both sides of the industry. Essentially, you've got to be in the IRUs. The cables, submarine cables were built and designed to be sold as IRUs. That doesn't mean that you can't actually participate in the services sector. So I think you'll see that we'll play in both and continue to do that as we have over the last 10 years. Other questions? Sure.
Thanks. Maybe just some examples of companies that have migrated from data centers up to the managed services side, and how were they successful?
That's a tough question. I would say there's a lot of companies in that transition. I would say that I wouldn't say anyone has actually mastered it yet. Reality is, I would probably say there's 5 to 10 of the largest companies out there today that are actually in that migration space, and I would see let's let it go for the next 24 months and see whether they actually get there. It's a very, very challenging, similar to many of you worked for AT&T, but in the 1980s they had a theory that you actually could put computers and telephones together, and they actually bought NCR. And I think that was the first time the telecom companies started to look at the idea of the integration between computing and telecommunications. That was not a success story. And I would tell you, over the last 10 years, it's been a very, very difficult space for traditional telecom operators to exist. But I think people are changing, industry's changing, and there's always that opportunity. So I think the jury's still out, to give you my candid view. Thank you very much.